Welcome to Micro-Histories. I'm your host, Jason Bischoff-Wurstle from the New Haven Museum, and today we're talking about Brewsterville, a little-known section of New Haven here at the corner of East Street and Chapel Street that was established by James Brewster and went on to become the carriage capital of the United States, the Detroit of carriages. James Brewster arrived in New Haven in 1809. By 1810, he opened his first carriage shop. Brewster was determined to revolutionize the production of carriages, which up to that point were only produced generally in England, and they were generally quite expensive. He set to democratize the idea of the carriage in the sense that the Model T provided a car for every person nearly a century later. Brewster did indeed succeed in revolutionizing the production of carriages, making New Haven the Detroit of carriage making in the 19th century. Presidents Van Buren and Andrew Jackson used Brewster carriages as their personal escorts. And it was here on this ground, why we're here today, that Brewster established a 13-acre campus, an early industrial village. And on that village, he had spots for workers, which at the time, too, he revolutionized the idea of how to compensate workers as he paid actual wages every Saturday. Prior to that point, people would get paid in barter and trade at the company store. Brewster gave workers hard-earned wages. He also opened up institutes and introduced the working men to scientific ideas of inquiry and education, basically a continuing ed program of the 19th century in New Haven. At the time, when Brewster built his campus on the edge of what was the new township, here at the end of Worcester Street and East Street, this was on the far edges of the city. There were some businesses here that had been located from a previous age, more seafaring, as behind me over here was the little harbor at Water Street. The Pavilion Hotel he invested in and brought back to glory of its early heyday. And Beldock, where the steamboats would come back and forth from New York City, he invested in and later connected Beldock directly to the first railroad in Connecticut, the Hartford and New Haven, which through Brewster's involvement and investment, tying both his factory village and these buildings and businesses by the ocean to the railroad, created the New Haven as the first terminus for a railroad in Connecticut. This was a good thing and a bad thing, because he also created the conditions for which this highway eventually went in. It was one that, as I mentioned in our previous episode, once the railroad collapsed in the early 20th century, that led wide swaths of open and cheap land to build a highway on later in the 20th century. Brewster didn't just build a high-tech, for its era, factory campus. He also completed Wallace Street, Hamilton Street, connected Franklin Street to Worcester Street, and constructed Collis Street. And then once they were finished, as we stand here in the corner of Wallace Street, he gave them to the city. So he actually developed the area around from what was at that point just open countryside here by the waterfront. Bruce's fortunes in the carriage-making industry continued to boom until the period of the U.S. Civil War, as the strongest customer base for carriages in America was the southern states, and then later the Confederacy. And as the war broke out and the blockades rose, business in carriages dropped precipitously.
For James Brewster's company.
But Brewster had made his mark in both introducing the railroad and industry to this area. This side of Wooster Square, the eastern side, became dense with industry and tenement homes through the late 19th century and early 20th century. As the Great Depression wore on into World War II, industry declined rapidly, and the area fell into disrepair and was labeled slums. So how did we get to here from there? By the 1950s, the Wooster Square redevelopment project was in the works. And as I mentioned earlier, both I-95 was now cutting off Wooster Square from the harbor, and I-91 was about to be established, heading northward all the way to Montreal. And there was the idea of the placement. The placement of I-91 to my right as an elevated highway split what was now known the western side of Wooster Square, where the square actually is, into a residential area, and this side became strictly industrial, aside from Farnham Courts. That meant any sort of mixed use or tenement homes, apartments, etc., were torn down and eradicated. The new industrial use for this area was the intent to create an industrial park similar to what you'd see in the suburbs. And East Street was supposed to become the new industrial park zone. While there was some success with that through the 20th century, there was also failure. But today, the wheel moves forward. As we see, new industry, warehouses going in for quick delivery, such as Amazon or Target or what have you that you buy on the internet, is going on. And the evolution continues. And the evolution of the wheel moving forward, as James Brewster had the foresight in 1810 when he first came to New Haven. So for Micro-Histories, I'm your host, Jason Bischoff-Wurstle. Please hit the subscribe button. Please keep it tuned. We'll have more episodes ahead. And let us know in the comments what little bit of New Haven you want to know more about. Thanks.